Welcome to Lecture 10, CS10, Social Implications of Computing. Woo! All right. So here's what we're going to talk about today. Today is social implications of computing. One of the big important ideas of this class is that this class is not just programming. I want you to really make sure you understand our mantra. It is about understanding the cultural and societal implications of computing, as well as learning how to program and the empowering part of learning to compute, learning to program. So today we're going to look at the following things. In class, usually in lecture is big ideas, right? And motivation for things, and also we do lecture this cultural context stuff. So that's cool. So Brian summarized when he teaches this. It's like, what? Are you kidding me? And this is really important. So let me read this to you because it's so good. You can just close your eyes if you want. This is so good. Multiple choice tests, okay, which are now pervading high school and K-12 education in this country, have changed what counts as knowledge in schools. Open-ended questions were the norm 30 years ago. This kind of knowledge you can report on the kind of knowledge you can report on multiple choice tests is unimportant in the big scheme of things. And what's really important is not what you already know, but how you can take what you know and synthesize and apply it to something you've never seen before. Multiple choice tests make that hard. Teaching follows tests. Maybe you've noticed. The folks who invented standardized testing didn't foresee how it would affect what knowledge means. And this is a meta idea in this course of an unintended consequence of technology. That's really the big idea in terms of the right brain part, in terms of the non-programming part. The big idea on the programming side is abstraction, recursion, higher order functions. The big idea in the kind of right brain part, the societal part, is unintended consequences. There are very few things that are purely good or purely evil. There usually is a neat technology, but you don't realize there's a side effect. Oh, great, PlayStation 3, this great stuff. Unintended side consequences, carpal tunnel syndrome from kids who are now in 9th grade who can't write anymore because they've been video gaming too much, okay? You have cars that drive themselves, wonderful. Unintended consequence, lots of them, right? More accidents, fewer accidents, who knows, right? Maybe people may... calculators in K-12, unintended consequence, if you don't have a calculator, you don't actually know how to do any arithmetic, right? You're reliant on it. So an unintended consequence, which is much deeper and more rich here, I mean, rich is the wrong word, but deeper and more important, is that what counts as knowledge has followed what you can test. And that's wrong. It's wrong that that's followed that way. In that A through E clicker technologies, things you can automatically grade and then rate your teacher based on something, standardized test, GRE, SAT, all that stuff, is A through E stuff. And synthesis and general purpose design and applying what you know into something you've never seen before and allowing you to go in a million different ways is the important thing, right? That's what life is about. Life is about, now we have to design a new airplane. Well, what was wrong with the old one? How do we go? And it's not an A through E of airplanes. You have to go in this wonderfully open, infinite design space. You can't multiple choice test that. So this is a really important thing, that these clicker technologies, or the A through A way of thinking of things, has fundamentally changed what knowledge is, and that's really important and sad in a way. Okay? So, the folks who 30 years ago said, oh boy, young whippersnappers, blah, 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 back in my day, there really is something that to say. That back in their day, knowledge really meant something. That what you were taught in schools was the most important thing. And what you're taught here may not be as important as what they were taught 30 years ago. Okay? In terms of how they focus their teaching. So it's really important that you get that answer right. Understand why that answer is D. This clicker stuff has changed it for the negative side, not for the positive side, for the negative side more than anything else. Okay? Fortunately, not as much in universities. So we're still okay here in our padded world of the ivy-covered buildings. But it really is the case that in K-12, where a lot of the learning happens for many of the people in the world, things have changed thanks to or due to, unfortunately, due to these clickers and due to A through E, circle the box. So let's talk about computer use in education. This is Judah Schwartz, and he had this wonderful example of a continuum, of a spectrum of computer use in education. So you've got, he divided computer use in education into 3 different categories, compartments. Tools, microworlds, and courseware. Let's talk about those. So a tool is something in which what you do with it is never part of the plan. It is an open general tool like a hammer. The person who built a hammer didn't envision all the millions of things you can use a hammer for. People use hammers for opening bottles. That's supposed to hammer a nail, right? No, you can use a hammer for all these wonderful things. You can use a hammer for getting through doors or something. That's different than just hammering a nail. So tools in this way of thinking of, here's a general purpose thing, and you can, the intended concept, the intended use of it is wide open. It's not done by the designer. It's wide open to use for many different reasons. Word processor, a browser, and a programming language. Right? You can do a million things with these things, and they're really general. A micro world means it is not fully courseware, which is I'm telling you exactly what to do at this stage, but here is a limited domain that gives you a lot of freedom, but it's enough constraint that you can actually build a lot of rich interactivity into that system. So there's interactive geometry, there's a physics simulation, and there's databases. So you can imagine this middle column as things that let you play in a space that feels very large in that space. A physics simulation is amazing. You can do all these things with physics and springs and friction and pulleys and weights and masses and forces, but it's still just physics, right? So it's kind of not everything, but it really within that space is really quite rich. And you can do a lot of really wonderful things there, and I'll show you a video of that.
I'll start by drawing a simple hill. I'll anchor it to the background. I'll put a little cart on the hill, give it wheels, pin the wheels to the frame with some axles, and then indicate that I want gravity. And now if I'd drawn this on a piece of paper and shown it to you, you'd understand what it is that was about to happen. I want the computer to be able to understand what's going to happen as well. And I can simply push the run button. Now, one of the nice things about an online environment is we can have the advantage of having it feel like paper and yet be able to do things that are not possible to do on paper. For example, I can take this and decide that I don't have it in quite the right place, and what I'd really like to do is move it just a bit and put it over here. And this time what I'd like to do is make the simulation a little bit more interesting and a little bit more complicated. We'll add a speed bump and anchor it to the frame, and we'll add a pendulum. And now let's see what it is that our system is going to do in operation. Now, let me try another device. This time, something a little more similar to the kind of thing that might happen in a real design environment. Here you see I've circled all of my previous drawings, and I'm just going to get rid of it by saying, scratch that out. And let's try a simple little marble game, the kind of thing that we might have in a real design environment. I'm going to draw a collection of boards for the marbles to run down. I'll anchor them to the background. Put one more board down here. And let's give them a cup to fall into. And just to make it interesting, we'll anchor the cup with a couple of springs. Put some marbles up here. Okay, now let's see what this does. Oops, not quite. Let's go back to the drawing board, literally, and see if we can't fix things. Suppose we take this shelf and move it a little bit. And then let's take this shelf over here and move it a little bit. And this time let's try grabbing the cup, changing its location. All right, we've succeeded. Now, what I wanted to show you is we have a design environment, the beginnings of a powerful design environment that allows a kind of natural and familiar style of interaction.
That's a perfect example of what a microworld is. You're living in this physics simulation, you're doing all these wonderful things. Maybe you're just playing, maybe you're just creating, or maybe your goal is to do, 2 ramps and a jump, and you figure out what that is and what the numbers are, and just teaching you some basic understanding of Newtonian physics. So that is an example of a really, really nice set of an example of a microworld, okay, in which you live in this little world, and it doesn't necessarily tell you what to do, but you have some space and there's some limitations to that. Courseware is the right side of it, in which very much like imagine Khan Academy, you can imagine computer-assisted instruction or computer-managed instruction. The difference between the bottom 2 boxes or computer-managed instruction is very much like what Moodle does, in which it manages the whole course. That's kind of the course manager. It tells you where you are and how far you've gone through that. And Khan Academy has that as well. Computer-assisted instruction is for each particular activity. Are you doing something? Is it letting you interactively work in maybe a small BYOB space where it's asking you to fill in the gap and runs it and sees that it does? And that's part of the larger computer-managed instruction, which is managing your flow through the whole course. So that's really courseware, which tells you exactly to do this in a particular way, and maybe a particular order to that is not really a lot of flexibility. So this is computer use in education, all of that, the 3 spaces of that, okay? So now I'm going to show you a video. We're going to talk about this afterwards. This is called RSAnimate. The Royal Society of Great Britain has a Royal Society, and they've had wonderful talks, just like the TED series of talks. This is an amazing talk by Sir Ken Robinson, and what they've done is the animate pieces, they've had an amazing illustrator draw a visual sense of what the person is saying. So you get to watch this video, and you're getting to visually, rather than just close your eyes and listen to this a podcast of it, you're seeing this visual description of what it is, and the illustrator is quite incredible. So as a combination, this is a very powerful talk. Make notes of things that you think are different from how you're currently learning today, because he says, this is how we're learning today, and this is how we should be learning. What I want you to do is go into this thinking about what you're currently doing and how it could be better. Okay, so make some notes.
Every country on earth at the moment is reforming public education. There are 2 reasons for it. The first of them is economic. People are trying to work out, how do we educate our children to take their place in the economies of the 21st century? How do we do that? Given that we can't anticipate what the economy will look like at the end of next week, as the recent turmoil is demonstrating. How do we do that? The second, though, is cultural. Every country on earth is trying to figure out, how do we educate our children so they have a sense of cultural identity and so that we can pass on the cultural genes of our communities while being part of the process of globalization. How do we square that circle? The problem is they're trying to meet the future by doing what they did in the past. And on the way, they're alienating millions of kids who don't see any purpose in going to school. When we went to school, we were kept there with a story, which was if you worked hard and did well and got a college degree, you would have a job. Our kids don't believe that. And they're right not to, by the way. You're better having a degree than not, but it's not a guarantee anymore. And particularly not if the route to it marginalizes most of the things that you think are important about yourself. Some people say we have to raise standards as if this is a breakthrough. Like, really, yes, we should. Why would you lower them? I haven't come across an argument that persuades me of lowering them. But raising them, of course we should raise them. The problem is that the current system of education was designed and conceived and structured for a different age. It was conceived in the intellectual culture of the Enlightenment and in the economic circumstances of the Industrial Revolution. Before the middle of the 19th century, there were no systems of public education. Not really. I mean, you could get educated by Jesuits, if you had the money. But public education, paid for from taxation, compulsory to everybody and free at the point of delivery, that was a revolutionary idea. And many people objected to it. They said it's not possible for many street kids, working class children, to benefit from public education. They're incapable of learning to read and write, and why are we spending time on this? So there's also built into it a whole series of assumptions about social structure and capacity. It was driven by an economic imperative of the time, but running right through it was an intellectual model of the mind, which was essentially the Enlightenment view of intelligence. That real intelligence consists in the capacity for a certain type of deductive reasoning and a knowledge of the classics originally, what we come to think of as academic ability. And this is deep in the gene pool of public education, that there are really two types of people, academic and non-academic, smart people and non-smart people. And the consequence of that is that many brilliant people think they're not, because they've been judged against this particular view of the mind. So we have twin pillars, economic and intellectual. And my view is that this model has caused chaos in many people's lives. It's been great for some. There have been people who have benefited wonderfully from it. But most people have not. Instead, they suffer this. This is the modern epidemic, and it's as misplaced and it's as fictitious. This is the plague of ADHD. Now, this is a map of the incidence of ADHD in America, or prescriptions for ADHD. Don't mistake me here. I don't mean to say there is no such thing as attention deficit disorder. I'm not qualified to say if there is such a thing. I know that a great majority of psychologists and paediatricians think there is such a thing. But it's still a matter of debate. What I do know for a fact is it's not an epidemic. These kids are being medicated as routinely as we had our tonsils taken out. And on the same whimsical basis, and for the same reason, medical fashion. Our children are living in the most intensely stimulating period in the history of the earth. They're being besieged with information and calls for their attention from every platform, computers, from iPhones, from advertising hoardings, from hundreds of television channels. And we're penalizing them now for getting distracted. From what? Boring stuff. At school, for the most part. It seems to me it's not a coincidence totally that the incidence of ADHD has risen in parallel with the growth of standardized testing. Now, these kids are being given Ritalin and Adderall and all manner of things, often quite dangerous drugs, to get them focused and calm them down. But according to this, attention deficit disorder increases as you travel east across the country. People start losing interest in Oklahoma. They can hardly think straight in Arkansas. And by the time they get to Washington, they've lost it completely. And there are separate reasons for that, I believe. It's a fictitious epidemic. If you think of it, the arts, and I don't say this exclusively of the arts, I think it's also true of science and of maths, but I say about the arts particularly because they are the victims of this mentality currently, particularly. The arts especially address the idea of aesthetic experience. An aesthetic experience is one in which your senses are operating at their peak, when you're present in the current moment, when you're resonating with the excitement of this thing that you're experiencing, when you are fully alive. An anesthetic is when you shut your senses off and deaden yourself to what's happening. And a lot of these drugs are that. We're getting our children through education by anesthetizing them. And I think we should be doing the exact opposite. We shouldn't be putting them asleep. We should be waking them up to what they have inside of themselves. But the model we have is this. I believe we have a system of education that is modeled on the interests of industrialism and in the image of it. I'll give you a couple of examples. Schools are still pretty much organized on factory lines, ringing bells, separate facilities, specialized into separate subjects. We still educate children by batches. We put them through the system by age group. Why do we do that? Why is there this assumption that the most important thing kids have in common is how old they are? It's like the most important thing about them is their date of manufacture. You know what I mean? Well, I know kids who are much better than other kids at the same age in different disciplines, or at different times of the day, or better in smaller groups than in large groups, or sometimes they want to be on their own. If you're interested in the model of learning, you don't start from this production line mentality. It's essentially about conformity, and increasingly it's about that as you look at the growth of standardized testing and standardized curricula. And it's about standardization. I believe we've got to go in the exact opposite direction. That's what I mean about changing the paradigm. There was a great study done recently of divergent thinking. It was published a couple of years ago. Divergent thinking isn't the same thing as creativity. I define creativity as the process of having original ideas that have value. Divergent thinking isn't a synonym, but it's an essential capacity for creativity. It's the ability to see lots of possible answers to a question, lots of possible ways of interpreting a question, to think what Edward de Bono would probably call laterally, to think not just in linear or convergent ways, to see multiple answers, not one. So, there are tests for this. One kind of cod example would be people might be asked to say, how many uses can you think of for a paperclip? One of those routine questions. Most people might come up with 10 or 15. People who are good at this might come up with 200. And they do that by saying, well, could the paperclip be 200 foot tall and be made out of foam rubber? Does it have to be a paperclip as we know it, Jim? Now, there are tests for this, and they gave them to 1,500 people. This is in a book called Breakpoint and Beyond. And on the protocol of the test, if you scored above a certain level, you'd be considered to be a genius at divergent thinking. Okay? So my question to you is, what percentage of the people tested, of the 1,500, scored at genius level for divergent thinking? Now, you need to know one more thing about them. These were kindergarten children. So what do you think? What percentage at genius level? 80. 80, okay. 98%. Now, the thing about this was it was a longitudinal study. So they retested the same children 5 years later, ages of 8 to 10. What do you think? 50? They retested them again 5 years later, ages 13 to 15. You can see a trend here, can't you? Now, this tells an interesting story, because you could have imagined it going the other way, couldn't you? You start off not being very good, but you get better as you get older. But this shows two things. One is we all have this capacity, and two, it mostly deteriorates. Now, a lot of things have happened to these kids as they've grown up. A lot. But one of the most important things that happened to them, I'm convinced, is that by now they've become educated. They've spent 10 years at school being told there's one answer, it's at the back. And don't look. And don't copy, because that's cheating. Outside schools, that's called collaboration, but inside schools. Now, this isn't because teachers want it this way, it's just because it happens that way. It's because it's in the gene pool of education. We have to think differently about human capacity. We have to get over this old conception of academic, non-academic, abstract, theoretical, vocational, and see it for what it is, a myth. Secondly, we have to recognize that most great learning happens in groups, that collaboration is the stuff of growth. If we atomize people and separate them and judge them separately, we form a kind of disjunction between them and their natural learning environment. And thirdly, it's crucially about the culture of our institutions, the habits of the institution and the habitats that they occupy.
What are some things you wrote down of how the world currently works for you and how you'd like it to work? Many of you have never thought of it this way, right? This is kind of waking you up to how things are currently working, and I agree with almost everything you said. Other things that you made a note of that maybe are applicable to how we could change things. Did you notice how we gave you your project? You have a project of your choice, right? Whatever is interesting to you. It's not about us, it's about you. It's letting you go in your separate ways. Did you make you work alone? No. You're working with a partner, right? So, and maybe even partners of 3 if that's the best way that it can work out. So it's bringing people together collaboratively, okay? That's a big idea. It is some other things that are connected to this class also are maybe thinking about individual learning and how people learn at different rates and how we can adapt to that.